Elk are heroic. I mean, what they go through year in and year out. They're running from grizzlies and wolves that are pursuing them. They've got challenges with weather. They've got challenges of roads and fences and development in their way.
Why are we so drawn to migrations? It seems like it's because we see something about ourselves in the journey that these animals are on. Elk have really captured a lot of our attention just because they're so important in the ecology of the ecosystem.
Elk are really the keystone species that a lot of our large carnivores that we love so much, grizzly bears, Yellowstone gray wolves, are really dependent on those elk populations for their own health. And then you have scavenger species like eagles and coyotes that depend on the elk as well.
They're also really important outside the parks to the hunting and outfitting industry there for all that economic opportunity associated with those enterprises. And because of that economic activity, they're just sort of this linchpin for the system.
The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is about 22 million acres. So it's a massive ecosystem. It's the size of a handful of states put together.
One of the really special things about elk is they migrate. They follow the best conditions throughout the year in terms of food and shelter, and so they spend a lot of time up in the mountains and in the core areas like Yellowstone in the summer, where they get food, they get fat, they breed, they have their baby calves, but then they try to get away from the deep snow in the winter, and they move out into these surrounding valleys and plains.
I remember getting on a school bus 8 years old and seeing migrations of elk. Hundreds of them. And the pathways are still there in the hillside. So these pathways speak to ancient historic migratory highways.
The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem is alive and beating, and it is. It's through the elk or the bloodline that moves through the system.
One of the large elk herds in the ecosystem is the northern herd, which really uses that northern corridor north into Paradise Valley quite heavily during the winter.
There's significant public land here. And yet, when public land during hunting season sees an insurgence of human traffic and hunters, naturally those animals are going to go to where the pressure isn't, and that's where private land becomes a boon.
Up to 80% of the time that elk spend in the winter is on private ranch lands. Elk don't read signs. They don't know if they're moving from private land onto state land, onto federal land, and all of those units are managed a little bit different.
To the elk, it's all land. It's habitat, it's terrain. These big private holdings actually represent, I would say, a serious benefit to elk populations in that it's a protected zone, to the chagrin of the rancher who's trying to grow grass to feed cattle.
In my time interacting with landowners, ranchers, working with livestock on the landscape, you hear a variety of things. All of them almost universally say, we appreciate these elk and this phenomenon of migration. But, they bring some challenges. A particularly serious one is brucellosis, which is a reproductive disease that is in elk and bison in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And an outbreak, a spillover event from elk to livestock, can range into the hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of the cost to the livestock producer.
We have a cow-calf operation, so at the end of the day, we sell pounds of calf. And that's what we aim for, big and heavy, and sometimes we get there better years than others. That's sort of the ranch in a nutshell. I love the animals. It was a big learning curve, but I really like it. That's what drives you to do all of this. The cost of elk on your property isn't just connected to brucellosis, even though that's a very big threat. It's also property damage. Fences and all of those things are really a problem. And then it comes down to how much they eat. Anything they put in their mouths is what we can't put in our cows' mouths.
They come down out of the mountains, they've got predators behind them, and they've got disease, and they knock down fences, and that's a major cost of sharing the landscape with these elk. The reason that they're hanging out on private lands is, in a sense, it's that something's going well there. Private landowners have been doing a good job taking care of this habitat. Let's ask them what we could be doing to help them, continue to do that. We see landowners throwing in the towel and saying, I can't find a way anymore. And we just see these private ranches blinking out more and more across the landscape.
Ranchers are just barely hanging on. We need to be able to help steer our future. And that's really difficult to do right now.
A big part of healthy elk herds are going to be these private ranches and working lands. And how can we bring people with common interest of wanting to see healthy elk together with the people who provide habitat for healthy elk?
Trying to preserve the large landscape is really difficult. There is a problem with development threatening habitat. Paradise Valley basically has been discovered. There's a lot of second homeowners.
It's subdivision. It's parceling off pieces of these larger properties into smaller and smaller units. At the next house and the next house is competing to be closer and closer to that wild system. And it's a major threat for not just elk, but mule deer, antelope, to moose and bighorn sheep, to the grizzly bear, to the wolf, because the more people we have in the mix in these places, the more opportunity for conflict.
And these ranchers, at the end of the day, they'll be pressured to sell, and the selling will lead to development, and it'll lead to ranchettes, and it'll think about how do we keep these ranches intact. And that goes back to economics.
There are places that we're going to want to develop, but there might also be places where we'd rather utilize that area to maintain wildlife. And, a valley like Paradise Valley is a critical place to have that conversation.
We want to live within nature. That's part of the attraction to being in Paradise Valley. And at the end of the day, I guess the question is, well, what price are you willing to pay?
Private lands like Dreska's are an absolutely critical part of the solution in terms of maintaining these populations in perpetuity. And so we have to be in conversation with these landowners, learning what works for them, what their concerns are, what their hopes and fears are, and then building solutions around those conversations.
This is an exercise in how do we keep ranching viable? And if we keep ranching viable, we keep elk healthy. It doesn't have to be government that comes in and fixes this problem. There's a demand out there. There's a demand for healthy elk herds, and there are people who are really interested in it who want to help. We're exploring ideas, everything from brucellosis, financial risk instruments like a brucellosis bond, to elk occupancy agreements, to hunting tags, to compensation funds, ways that we can capture the passion that everybody has for the wildlife and really provide value to that wildlife as well as to the ranchers who actually absorb a lot of the costs of healthy ecosystems.
The more that we can bridge our learning about the ecological system with the economic expertise that an organization like PERC brings, the better solutions that we're going to be able to put together for the landowner. The process, and getting people together and looking for common ground and being creative and finding solutions that's what we need to see repeated around the landscape.